Chapter 6. Debbie found herself growing closer and closer to Frank as the days went by. On Wednesday, she found a cook, and she told him about it as they ate lunch at the cafe. Her name is Samantha, and she's got a degree in culinary arts. She grinned and raised her voice to be heard on the other side of the diner. She cooked a snack for me, and she's a better cook than Bob is. Bob came out of the kitchen brandishing his spatula. Who said that? Debbie raised her hand, and he narrowed his eyes at her for a moment, before shaking his head. If you weren't my mother-in-law. Frank and Debbie both laughed as he headed into the kitchen, and Kelsey waddled over, a huge grin on her face. That made me a lot happier than it probably should have. Debbie grinned. How are you feeling today? Very, very round. I swear I feel like I'm a beach ball. You look beautiful. Kelsey sighed. Are we still on for the snow sculpting contest this weekend? I don't know that snow sculpting is a good idea. How far along are you? Debbie hated the idea of letting Kelsey get out there in the snow. She knew it wouldn't kill her, but it might cause her to go into premature labor. 38 weeks. If the baby comes this week, it's no big deal. Debbie frowned at that. But your mom isn't here yet. Kelsey shrugged. I really want her to be here, but you said you'd fill in for her if she's not, and that takes a load off my mind. I wish it took a load off mine, Debbie mumbled. Bertie, and I heard that. Not another ridiculous name. Debbie didn't want to ask, but she couldn't seem to help herself. Bertie? I woke up to the sound of birds singing this morning, and I thought it would be nice to honor singing birds by naming my baby after them. Don't you think? Debbie shook her head. No, I really don't. Kelsey frowned. Why does no one like the names I choose? She walked away from the table, going to pick up the two specials in the window. Chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes. She put the plates in front of Debbie and Frank. Enjoy, and let me know if you need me to bring you my spice. At that, Bob stuck his head out of the kitchen. Not everyone puts Cajun seasoning on every single thing they stick in their mouth, Kelsey. Well, they should. Debbie looked at Frank with a grin. Do we come here for the good food or for the show? Both. Definitely both. He cut off a bite of his steak and popped it into his mouth. I swear everything he cooks makes my taste buds jump up and sing. Do you have your team all ready for the competition Saturday? Debbie asked. He nodded. I do. But you get no information, because you won't give me any. I told you who's on my team. I just didn't tell you what we're making. Not that any decisions had been made about what they'd sculpt. Frank leveled her with a look. No information at all. Fine. Debbie sipped her water. Everything's just about ready to open the Kids Korral. I think we'll actually be ready a day or two early. Wade will make you open early then. Good. Do you have any idea how much I've missed working with small children? It's been so many years. She couldn't believe how excited she was at the idea of opening the Korral. It's going to be hard work to keep that open. It's 7 days a week, right? Debbie nodded. I have an assistant manager who is taking night shift. 2 college students will be managers on the weekend, and we'll take turns being on call. It's going to be a lot of work, but I can't even express how excited I am. He grinned at her. I'm glad you're doing it, then. He looked down for a moment. How would you feel about going to a movie with me on Saturday night? I was thinking it would be nice to have some time away from the ranch together. Debbie studied him for a minute. Are you asking me on a date, Frank? Frank met her gaze, his brown eyes steady on hers. What if I am? She took a deep breath and slowly nodded. I think I'd say yes if you were. Really? No more of this only friends thing? Now we're in the taking it slowly stage. Of course. It's not like I'm going to try anything. I haven't even held your hand yet. She smiled at that. One step at a time. This is new for me. She couldn't believe she'd actually agreed to go out with him as more than friends. She'd wanted something more to happen, but she'd been the one to put brakes on things. Thank you for taking some time to be my friend first. It means a lot to me. He took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing the tips of her fingers. Our relationship can only be stronger for the time as friends. I think so, too. Kelsey was suddenly beside their table. Did I just see Frank kiss your fingers? Does that mean you two are going to start dating? Her hands were clutched together on top of her huge belly, and she was obviously ecstatic about their relationship progressing. Debbie sighed. We're going out on Saturday evening, after we beat his team in the snow sculpting contest. Yay! I can't wait to tell. Let's not tell the world just yet, Frank said softly. I'm sure Debbie would rather Miranda heard it from her lips than yours. Kelsey nodded. I wasn't thinking. Mum's the word. And Bertie, of course. Debbie looked at Frank as soon as she'd left. We're going to have no privacy. None. No, we're really not. Privacy is out of our reach at the moment. She sighed. I guess I need to get used to living in a fishbowl. And I need to get used to the fact that I'm dating a woman with 2 kids in their 20s. I'm not sure how that's going to go. Does it make you nervous? Because they're definitely part of the package. A little. I know Miranda, but I've never met Scott. Is he going to hate me? I think I'd hate meeting a man who was dating my mom. Nah. Scott is pretty easygoing if you keep him filled up with his favorite foods. I'll feed him, and then you can come over after dinner. You'll be best friends in no time. Frank nodded. I like this plan. Seriously, Scott will respect you. He wants to join the Air Force, and he'll respect you simply because you're retired from the military. She liked the idea of him getting to know Scott. We'll bond when I take him up in my helicopter. She smiled. Don't worry about bonding with my kids just yet. We have to get through our first date. Think we can? I'm pretty sure we'll survive it. There's a new Chinese place in town. We'll go there for dinner, and then go see a movie. I have no idea what's showing, but I don't care. As long as we can sit in the dark theater and hold hands. Debbie grinned at him. You want to hold hands in the theater? Are you a handholder? He nodded. I think so. I've never really been in a serious relationship, but I like the idea of holding your hand. Well, I guess we'll see how we both like it then, won't we? Saturday morning the weather was nice. It was just at 30 degrees, so as warm as it could be without the snow melting. Debbie woke up excited. She didn't know what she was anticipating more, beating Frank's team in the contest or their first real date. In her mind, she had to admit that the time they'd spent together really had been dates. Maybe they hadn't been kissing or holding hands, but they had been getting to know one another with the thought of a relationship in mind. She met Frank at the Christmas tree, an old pine tree that had been part of the ranch since the first settlers had arrived on the ranch. My team is going to beat your team, she whispered to him. No way. Kelsey hurried over then, and her gloved hand caught Debbie's arm. We're not fraternizing with the enemy. We're going to take them down. There were 6 teams total and lots of spectators. They had exactly 3 hours to make the best sculpture they could make. Each team would be given a small area to work in, where the other teams couldn't see them, and Danny and Travis would be the ones to walk around through them all judging the competition. Debbie huddled up with her group of women, talking to them softly. Anyone have any idea what we're doing? She asked. None, Miranda told her. I watched last year, but I really don't know what we're supposed to do. Kelsey rubbed her hands together excitedly. We have to make a snow sculpture. Has to be at least 5 feet high. We get points on creativity, but if it's under 5 feet, we're disqualified. Debbie nodded. Okay. We can do this. Is anyone here 5 feet tall? That would help us gauge how tall it needs to be. Bridget raised her hand. I'm a little over 5 feet. Make it as tall as me, and we're gold. Sounds good. I guess we'll figure out what we're making when we get to our area. Danny came over and led them to their section of land. No running around spying on other teams. She looked at her twin. Kelsey, I don't like you doing this. Mom isn't here yet. Kelsey shrugged. She's supposed to be. They said they'd be in town yesterday afternoon. Yeah, there was a blizzard in Colorado, and they had to take a longer route. She's thinking tomorrow if the mountains are passable. Danny bit her lip. What if you go into labor? I want Mom and Dad here, but I'm not going to give up on fun if I don't have to. Danny shook her head, knowing better than to argue with her twin. Fine. We'll be back in a few hours to check on you. If you need a bathroom break, you have to flag one of us down to escort you. Just come back every 20 minutes from me then. Delilah is dancing on my bladder today. Danny didn't take the bait and mention the name her sister had called the baby. Debbie decided she was wise. After she'd walked off, they all started rolling snowballs. We'll merge them together, Kelsey explained. I think I really want to try to make Bigfoot this year. Kaya shrugged. Sounds like fun to me. Me too. Bridget agreed, surprising everyone. Kaya and Bridget were twins and agreed on almost nothing. Miranda shrugged. I can get behind Bigfoot. Debbie smiled. All right. We're making Bigfoot. The 5 women worked together, first rolling huge snowballs and then carefully molding them together. Kelsey ran off to the bathroom at least twice an hour, but no one complained. Everyone did their best to make the work easier for her. When it had been 2 hours, Debbie called a halt. We're going to have hot chocolate and cookies as a snack. I think it's smarter to take 10 minutes to warm ourselves and regain our energy than it would be to try to power through. Everyone agreed, and Kelsey sat down on the bench near their area. Debbie took her the snack and sat beside her. You don't have to continue. I don't think you should. You look like you're in pain. Kelsey shrugged. I'm at the point of the pregnancy where everything hurts, so what difference does it make? Please take care of yourself. Oh, this is fun. It's not like I'm doing construction work. I'm helping build a snow Bigfoot. All right, Debbie said, not wanting to argue. She still had a feeling something was wrong, but she couldn't force Kelsey to tell her. As they were done with their snack, Danny came around. Is it time for your potty break, sister dear? Kelsey grinned. You have my bladder on a timer. Have I ever told you that you're the best twin ever? Danny rolled her eyes, but she stayed beside her sister as they walked to the restroom, obviously concerned she was going to hurt herself. When the call of 15 minutes came, they were putting the finishing touches on the Bigfoot. Debbie was impressed with how lifelike it looked. I wish we could use raisins for his eyes, she said with a frown. Pine cones, Kelsey said. We can use anything we find outside. We just can't bring anything with us. Bridget and Kaya hurried off to find pine cones, while the others continued to work. Sticks were used to shape the face, and when the others came back with the pine cones, Kelsey poked them into place. He's beautiful. Will came around the corner of the house and immediately started laughing. He was Kelsey and Danny's older brother, and he had long made fun of Kelsey's obsession with Bigfoot. I can't believe you talked them into building Bigfoot, he said, shaking his head. He's beautiful, isn't he? Kelsey beamed at her brother. The other 3 Weston men rounded the corner of the house, Maddie, Belinda, Ellie, and Amber with them. Wade simply shook his head, but Wyatt and Wes both laughed. Wes walked over close. Danny said we had to see what you made. I'm not surprised. Wade walked closer to look at it. This is a good likeness. Almost as real looking as the drawings you were always making of Bigfoot on your notebooks in school. If Debbie hadn't been watching Kelsey, she wouldn't have seen the younger woman wince. Did you hurt yourself? No, I'm fine, Kelsey protested. Debbie wasn't convinced, but she knew she'd ask again later. During the judging process, which really only took about 20 minutes, Debbie kept her eyes on Kelsey. She didn't seem right to her. Danny and Travis came over and looked at the Bigfoot, and all the other Westons watched them. Danny nodded at the sculpture, leaning close to Travis to whisper with him. Travis and Danny would be marrying after the elder Westons returned, but they seemed to be very happily in love to Debbie. A moment later, Travis nodded. Okay, let's all gather by the Christmas tree to announce who won. They all traipsed across the snow-covered ground, Debbie staying right beside Kelsey. I'm worried about you. Are you sure you're all right? Kelsey nodded. I'm fine. Danny had 3 ribbons in her hand. Everyone did a great job, she yelled, doing her best to be heard. But we only have 3 prizes to give. She looked around. I need the team captains to step forward. Debbie looked at Kelsey for a moment, not wanting to leave her side. Kelsey pushed her. Go. Debbie stepped up beside Frank, not even looking at him. Our 3rd place prize is for the beautiful sculpture of a cat, made by Jason Small's team. Congratulations, Jason. Danny called loudly. Jason, one of the ranch's guests, stepped forward for his ribbon, holding it high above his head. I'd like to thank the Academy. And my mom. I will always thank my mom. Jason's wife shook her head, grabbing his arm and pulling him over to his family. Hush you. Everyone laughed, and Danny waited for things to quiet down before continuing. Our 2nd place team was the sculpture of Snoopy, sleeping on his doghouse made by Frank Watkins's team, which means we have had an upset this year. Frank's team has won the last 2 years. Or was it 3? Doesn't matter, congratulations on 2nd place, Frank. Frank stepped forward and took the ribbon, holding it high for his teammates to see. Thank you. Our 1st place winner with a huge Bigfoot is Debbie White's team. Congratulations, Debbie. Debbie stepped forward and took the ribbon, smiling as she looked at it. Bigfoot was all Kelsey's idea, and she was out there sculpting it at 8.5 months pregnant. I think Kelsey should get to keep the ribbon. She handed the ribbon to the younger girl, who once again had a pained look on her face. Kelsey? Kelsey gripped her stomach through her heavy winter coat. Remember how you said you'd go to the hospital with me if my mom wasn't here? Debbie felt her heart drop into her stomach. You're in labor, and you kept sculpting Bigfoot? Kelsey shrugged. I'm not a quitter. But my water broke an hour ago. I think it's time to go. Debbie closed her eyes. You wait here, I'll go get my car. I can drive it close enough that you'll only have to walk a few feet. She looked over her shoulder, noticing that no one else realized what was happening. Someone call the sheriff. He's about to be a father. Danny had her phone out before Debbie started for her car, Frank at her side. Let's take my truck. It's closer. Debbie nodded, hurrying with him. I'm sorry, but I don't think I'll be able to go out with you tonight. Frank shrugged. Tomorrow night then. Who cares? This ranch is about to have a princess named Widget or Birdie or maybe even Willardita. Debbie sighed. We have to get Shane to the hospital before she gives birth. She does not need to be naming that baby on her own. Danny's calling him. I'm sure they'll meet us there. How long has she been in labor? Any idea? I've been noticing pained looks for a couple of hours. Debbie shook her head. I should have listened to my instincts. She should not have been sculpting snow this morning. He put his hand on her arm as he parked the truck in the middle of the old west town in front of the tree. You couldn't have stopped her. If you hadn't let her be on your team, she would have just found another team. Kelsey does whatever Kelsey wants to do. She's the most hard-headed Weston in a family of very hard heads. Debbie jumped out of the truck, walking to Kelsey and taking one arm. Will pushed her out of the way, scooping Kelsey up and carrying her. You're sopping wet and a little bit gross at the moment, he said as he put her into the back seat of the truck. We're all following. Danny got into the truck. I'm going too. My twin sister is having a baby, and you're not keeping me away. Debbie made sure Kelsey was buckled before she got back into the front seat, beside Frank. How long have you been in labor? I realized I was having contractions just before the contest started. What were you thinking participating then? Debbie asked, frustrated. If Miranda had done that, she'd be furious. I was thinking that first babies take a long time coming, so I wasn't going to waste time lying in a hospital bed when I could be playing in the snow. Kelsey's voice was defiant, but it sounded weaker than it had. Debbie turned around, and she could see tears on the younger woman's face. Are you okay? Kelsey nodded. I want Shane. I called him. He's on his way. I bet he beats us there. Danny reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. I want to hit him. Debbie grinned. I'm sure Shane expects nothing less from you. As Frank pulled in at the emergency exit, they saw the county-issued car pull into the parking lot with lights blaring. I think you've got your wish, Kelsey. Frank pointed in the direction of the police vehicle. Kelsey wiped away a tear. It's about time. What would he have done if I'd had the baby in the middle of the street without him? Debbie jumped out of the truck. I'm going to get a wheelchair. Wait there. Kelsey shook her head. I'm not an invalid. I'm going to walk into the hospital like any other healthy person. Rolling her eyes, Debbie decided not to argue. She opened Kelsey's door and offered her arm to the younger woman. At least lean on me. I'll do that. Kelsey walked slowly into the hospital, leaning heavily onto Debbie's arm, gripping Danny's as well as her sister went to her other side. Oh, and I have something I should probably tell you both. What's that? I'm not having a baby, Kelsey said as they took the elevator up to the maternity ward. So you swallowed a watermelon seed and have been trying out names on it? Debbie shook her head. I'm not buying it. I'm having 2 babies. Chapter 7. Debbie groaned. Twins? Does anyone know you're having twins? Sure. Shane knows. My doctor knows. His nurse knows. Kelsey smiled sweetly, obviously fighting the pain she was in. And now you know. Danny shook her head. You've lost your ever-loving mind, Kelsey Clapper. I could smack you right now. You can't. I'm in labor. Kelsey shrugged. I didn't want anyone to worry. And now everyone gets a big surprise. Getting out of the elevator, Debbie led Kelsey to the nurse's desk. My friend here is having a couple of babies. She didn't know why she was so frustrated with Kelsey, but she was. Who participates in a snow sculpture contest when she's pregnant with twins? 20 minutes later, they were checked in, and Kelsey was in a hospital gown. Shane rushed into the room. How are you feeling? Like I want to rip your lips off and feed them to Indy. Shane scowled at her. Who's Indy? You know, Will's dog. I want to rip your lips off and feed them to my brother's dog. You know why? Kelsey asked. Debbie pretended to be busy with something else, but she was listening to every word. She wanted to know why. Danny made a funny look, letting Debbie know that she was listening as well. No, but I'm sure you're going to tell me, because that's what you do. Shane said. Because if you didn't have any lips, you couldn't kiss me and make my knees melt, and I wouldn't be in this predicament. You're keeping your lips to yourself from now on, Shane Clapper. Of course, I am. Shane belied his words by leaning over and kissing Kelsey's forehead. I love you. A nurse came in then, hooking Kelsey up to a monitor. With the babies coming a couple of weeks early, we want to make sure they look all right. Okay, Kelsey said, sounding remarkably happy. Debbie knew at that moment they were all in for a long ride. She said a silent prayer that Mrs. Weston hurried. Asterisk. 6 hours later, Debbie was holding one baby while the doctor worked to deliver the other. Shane was clutching Kelsey's hand, whispering words of love. Danny was on the other side of the hospital bed, holding Kelsey's other hand. The first baby was already 15 minutes old, and the second was taking her own sweet time. During her hours of labor, Kelsey had admitted that she'd known she was having twins for more than 6 months, but hadn't wanted to make an announcement. She'd thought leaving it as a surprise would be better. Debbie thought she'd lost her mind, but she had no say in the matter, so she'd stayed out of the way as much as she could, standing beside Kelsey and holding her hand when the girl had wanted her there. She felt superfluous with Kelsey's husband and twin both there, but when she had offered to leave, Kelsey had insisted she stay. A few moments later, the doctor held up the second baby for Kelsey to see, while Shane cut the cord. They're both beautiful, Kelsey. Kelsey laughed and cried at the same time. We did it, Shane. 2 beautiful baby girls. Shane nodded, wiping a tear from his own eye. I have my Victoria. He sighed contentedly. Have you decided on a name for the other one? Danny's eyes grew round as she stared at Shane. You're letting her name one? Kelsey grinned, reaching out to take the baby that Debbie was holding. I think I'm going to call her Willow. Then she has the W name like I wanted, but it's a pretty W name. He looked relieved. I really was worried you'd name her Widget. Kelsey smiled, touching the baby's fingers, and silently counting them. I considered it, but Willow is prettier. A nurse took the second baby over to Kelsey, who held her in her other arm. I know how I want to make the announcement we had twins. There was a twinkle in Kelsey's eye that frightened Debbie a little. How? Shane asked. He looked skeptical. I want Debbie and Danny to each carry one out to the waiting room. Debbie should go first, and then Danny can follow 2 minutes later. Is anyone still here? Debbie laughed. Yeah. Frank, all of your siblings, half the guests, and about 15 employees of the ranch. I think the nurses are sick of them. I'm sure they are. The Westons alone are a pain in the rear. Kelsey grinned. You take Willow and go first. Danny smiled. I get the one with a normal name. Does that mean I win? Kelsey gave Victoria to her sister. Give her a 2-minute head start, Kelsey said. Shane rolled his eyes. You get Bossier by the day, dear wife. I'm a mom now. I have to be bossy. Debbie ignored them as she carried the baby back to the waiting room. She loved babies. She was happy hers were grown and the enormous responsibility of raising children was over, but she was glad to hold this little one, who was sleeping in her arms. When she reached the waiting room, all 5 of Kelsey's siblings crowded around her. She's beautiful, Will whispered, tracing the baby's cheek with the back of her finger. What's her name? This is Willow. Debbie felt tears prick her eyes. Everyone had waited so long, and listened to so many crazy names, that it felt good to have a real name, and a beautiful baby. At first, no one noticed as Danny stepped into the room. And then Will did a double take. Whose baby did you steal? Danny smiled. This is Victoria. Belinda burst into tears. She was pregnant herself, and Debbie had heard her complain about her hormones being out of control. Twins. We have twins. The ranch needs twins. Danny looked down at the sweet baby in her arms, her eyes misting and surprising everyone. Isn't she beautiful? Everyone looked at the beautiful babies, and the Weston siblings all took turns walking back to see Kelsey. Danny didn't let go of the baby in her arms, though. She couldn't seem to put her down. Asterisk. Debbie was exhausted as Frank drove her back to the ranch. I haven't eaten anything since the snack our snow sculpting team had. I'm starving. She wanted to go fall face first into bed, but she knew that if she went to bed without eating, she would be sick in the morning. He glanced at the clock in the car. Everything's closed at this time of night. I'll take you to your place, and I'll cook for you. Debbie yawned, shaking her head. You don't need to cook for me. I'm sure you're exhausted too. I got a nap in the waiting room. I don't mind cooking. I'm getting hungry too. I could take you to my place, but I think you'd rather be close to your own bed. He loved the idea of cooking for her when she was tired and hungry. A real man took care of his woman. She yawned behind her hand. Yeah, I'm pretty tired. So let me cook for you. All right. It felt strange to let him into her kitchen and wait while he cooked, but it wouldn't kill her. I'm going to shower while you cook. I'm still in my Snow Bigfoot building clothes. That's fine. He parked in front of her cabin. You did good today. She smiled. It was tough, and I felt like I was out of place, but I guess now I'm practiced for when Miranda has babies. You don't want any more? He asked. He held his breath as he waited for her answer. He didn't really want kids of his own at this stage of life. She shook her head. No, my kids are grown. I have no desire to start over. If you want kids, you should find someone who does. I feel like I'm too old for kids. I just wanted to make sure you weren't wanting more. I'd probably agree to anything to have you in my life. I am in your life, Frank. You don't need to change who you are for me. He reached out and stroked her cheek. You're not getting fed this way. Let's get inside and I'll cook. She nodded, opening the door and sliding out of the truck. Once the front door was unlocked, she walked straight back to the bedroom and pulled out some clean clothes. She found a pair of shorts and a t-shirt. She'd sleep in them after he left, but they would be fine to wear in front of him too. She showered and washed her hair, running a brush through it but leaving it wet. If he didn't like how she looked with her hair not fixed and no makeup on, he had the opportunity to run before it was too late. When she got into the kitchen, she saw that he'd made bacon and pancakes. She took her seat at the table and let him serve her. After she'd had a few bites, she felt a little more human. What a day. I know. When did you find out Kelsey was having twins? In the elevator on the way to the maternity ward. I can't believe she hid it for so long. Frank shook his head. Me neither. But at least there are no widgets or Willarditas. Do you think her parents know? Nope. She told me they didn't. That girl is a nut. Debbie ate the last of her pancakes and leaned back in her chair. Thanks for cooking for me. I really appreciate it. Happy to do it. He stood and started clearing the table. No, I'll get the dishes in the morning. I got them now. He put them into the dishwasher and started it. I probably didn't load it the way you would have, but I loaded it. That gets me a few brownie points, right? You have millions of brownie points after today. What are you going to do with them all? He walked to the table and caught her hand, pulling her to her feet. Save them up for a rainy day, I think. Walking to the door, he turned to her and cupped her face in his hands. May I kiss you? It's all I've thought about for 2 weeks, and I think you need to put me out of my misery. Well, that was romantic. He shrugged. At least you know what you're getting from me. His thumb rubbed her bottom lip. How about it? Do I get a kiss? She nodded nervously. It had been so long since she'd kissed a man, she wasn't sure she remembered how. Frank leaned down and brushed her lips with his hand going to the side of her neck, and his thumb stroked the soft skin there. We'll try for our first date again tomorrow, if you're willing. I'd like that a lot. Are you willing to leave right after church? He asked. He was still so close that she could feel his breath against her skin. Yeah, that would be fine. What are we going to do? You'll see. He brushed his lips against hers once more. Tomorrow. Debbie stood in the doorway watching him drive away, shivering in the cold night air. There was no doubt in her mind that she was starting to fall in love with a baseball cap-wearing pilot. She just prayed he was kind to her heart. Asterisk. Frank sat with Debbie, Miranda, and Bob at church the next day, and much to Debbie's surprise, Miranda had nothing to say about it. Are you coming to lunch? Miranda asked her mom. No, not today. Frank and I have plans. Debbie wasn't going to hide her relationship from her daughter, as much as she wanted to. For some reason, she felt like she was doing something wrong, dating Frank so openly, but Dale had been dead for 20 years. Surely, he would understand her dating someone else. What are you doing? Bob asked Frank. I can't say. I'm trying to surprise a certain lady who's listening. Frank squeezed Debbie's hand, which he'd held in his for the whole service. You ready? He asked her. She nodded, immediately hugging Miranda. I'll see you this week, I'm sure. I'm so glad to see you with Frank, Mom. He's good for you. You have a twinkle in your eye I've never seen before, Miranda whispered. Thanks for understanding. Debbie waved to Bob, and she and Frank left the little church in the middle of the Old West town. Now where are we going? Lunch first. How long do you plan on keeping me? Forever. Frank's answer was soft, but she heard it. Debbie blushed. I meant today. How long will you keep me today? She had no answer to the forever comment. She was still trying to get used to the idea that she was dating again after being alone for so many years. A few hours. I'll have you home before your curfew. She stuck her tongue out at him, realizing that he made her feel young again. She liked it. Fine. Don't tell me anything. I don't plan to. He drove toward town, secretly excited at the day he wanted to share with her. I'll tell you that I want to try the new Chinese place for lunch. I was talking to Elf the other day, and he says it's fabulous. Elf, huh? How did he get that unfortunate name, anyway? His real name is Elvis, which really isn't a lot better when you think about it. No, it's not. Poor guy. He was very attentive to her throughout lunch, his hand always holding hers. What are you doing next weekend? She grinned. I seem to have all my spare time eaten up by this man I met a couple of weeks ago. Oh. Snowmobiling it is, then. Would you believe I've never been? Debbie shook her head. I've lived in Idaho for more than 20 years, and I've never been on a snowmobile. I should probably be flogged. Nah. Your skin is too beautiful to mar it that way. Frank knew she was joking, but he couldn't imagine anyone doing anything to hurt her. It made him angry to think about. I don't know what to say to that. He shrugged. You don't have to say anything. He took a sip of water. Do you feel like we should go see Kelsey today? Debbie shrugged. I don't think so. I heard that her parents are in town now. I'm sure they're with her. She took a sip of her water. What are they like? Have you met them? He nodded. Yeah. They took off a couple of years ago. They're good people. Hardworking. They love their kids to distraction. Good. Those kids deserve to be loved to distraction. I'm sure Mrs. Weston is mad that they didn't make it back in time for the baby's births, but she'll find some way to make it up to Kelsey. Why did you let Kelsey help in the contest while she was in labor, anyway? She hid it from me. I had a feeling something was up, but every time I asked, she denied it. I figured it was something like that. Debbie grinned. Aren't you going to compliment me on my win? He shook his head. Nope. I'm just more determined than ever to beat you next year. I can't believe you guys made Bigfoot out of snow. That's such a Kelsey thing to do, but no one else would have agreed. I don't know why not. It was fun. She shrugged. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had a doctor assure me that she wasn't in labor before we started. That really must have freaked you out. I know you were hoping her mom would get here so you wouldn't have to be there. Not just for my sake. Debbie shook her head. I knew how badly Kelsey wanted her mom to be there for the birth. I wanted everything to be just how Kelsey wanted it. Will you be there when Miranda has a baby? Debbie shrugged. If she wants me there, I will. I never thought I'd be so excited at the prospect of being a grandmother, but I am. I figured I'd be happy waiting until I was 50 or 55. Now, I'm chomping at the bit. She's married, and I want grandbabies. He grinned. What are you going to do if they decide to wait? Cry a lot. She laughed softly. No, I'll agree with whatever decision the two of them make. It's not my place to even tell them what I want. Wow. You're a good mother-in-law, aren't you? Frank frowned. What about your parents? We've never really talked about them. They're in Kansas, I think you said? Debbie nodded. I grew up on a farm there. They still own it, but my older brother runs it. They live there with your brother's family? Actually, my mom came from an Amish family, and she insisted on a custom that the Amish had. There's a house for the parents on the same land, so when my brother got married, they moved to the parents' house. Frank tilted his head to one side. So your mother was Amish? That must have been weird growing up. Not really. She'd left the life years before. She shrugged. She sometimes missed her parents, because she wasn't allowed to visit, but she never said bad things about the life they lived, and she never complained about how it was growing up Amish. She just told us how things were, and we listened. How often do you see your parents? Not very. I try to fly down there every summer for a week, but they've never been to Idaho. Dad always said he couldn't leave the farm for that long, but he's been retired for 10 years. He still won't come. I think they're just happy there in Kansas, and don't have any desire to leave. Does that bother you? He asked. No. They're the same as they always were. They're homebodies, and they have no desire for anything else in life. They're happy that I made it on my own. I was always welcome to come home, too. They'd have welcomed the kids and me with open arms after Dale died, and my mom tried to talk me into coming home, but I refused. I had to know I could stand on my own 2 feet. I was one of those women who went from her father's house to her husband's. I think all women should have at least a little time alone before they marry. Miranda did. I encouraged her to. I didn't want my daughter following in my footsteps. I'm glad I married Dale when I did, but if I'd had even a year on my own, I'd have dealt with being a single parent so much easier after he died. Of course, then I'd have had one less year with him, so I'm glad it happened the way it did. But in a perfect world. I understand completely. Frank paid for their meal and stood. Let's get out of here. Where to now? Now is the surprise. He led her to the truck and started driving back toward the ranch. What kind of surprise could he have for her there? She decided not to worry about it and to just trust him. There was nothing more she could do anyway. Chapter 8. Frank pulled onto the ranch, driving into an area that was new to Debbie. He pulled up next to a helicopter and parked the truck. "I'm giving you a tour of this area of Idaho today." Debbie grinned. "Sounds like fun." "I've never been in a helicopter, and honestly, I've rarely been on a plane. I tend to drive wherever I need to go." "Well, this'll be a new experience. You're going to love how much you can see from the chopper. I'll take it down low to see special areas. We'll even be able to see my cabin." He couldn't wait to show her what he saw on a regular basis. It was special to him, and something he needed to share. "I'm excited." She had never really had a desire to be in a helicopter, but she was becoming so attached to the ranch and the people there, she loved the idea of exploring that way. She leaned across the long bench seat in the truck and pressed a kiss to Frank's cheek. "Thank you for making our first date fun for me." His arm slipped around her and he brushed his lips across her forehead. "Thanks for having a first date with me." She got out of the truck and followed him to the helicopter, putting on the earphones he handed her. He carefully went through a system check while she looked around the small space they were in. She was buckled in tightly, nervous and excited all at once. As they flew over the area, she was mesmerized by the beauty of Idaho. If there was a more beautiful place on God's green earth, she'd like to see it, because she truly didn't believe there was anything prettier in the whole world. 2 hours later, he set the chopper back down on the helipad and shut off the engine. He looked at her, seeing that her face was still lit up with excitement. "It's so beautiful here." "I knew it was, but this was all beyond my wildest imagination. I want to go up in the summer once, too, so I can see our world without its blanket of snow." He grinned, so pleased that she'd been as excited as he was. He took her hand and led her out of the helicopter and over to the truck. "That's all I had planned for today. Lunch and a tour." She wound her fingers through his. "It was a wonderful first date. I hope you're not a man who keeps trying to top himself with each subsequent date, because it's just not possible after this." "No, I think I'm good." "So will you take me home now?" He frowned. "I don't want to yet." "Well, why don't you come over and we'll watch something on Netflix, and I'll fix dinner for us." "You wouldn't mind?" Debbie shook her head. "I find that the more time I spend with you, the more time I want to spend with you. I'm still feeling a little guilty about forgetting all about Dale, but he's been gone for 20 years. If he didn't want me to move on and be happy by now, then he probably wasn't worthy of my love in the first place." Frank nodded, starting the truck. He still felt a tightness in his chest every time she mentioned Dale to him, but she was in her mid-40s. If she hadn't had at least one serious love by her age, there'd be something wrong with her. "I don't think you'll ever forget him." "No one would expect you to." "Have you talked to Jacqueline?" she asked, wondering about the rumors she'd heard about the woman. She knew Frank had probably avoided Jacqueline before her arrival, but now, she couldn't help but wonder if he'd taken the time to see her. Frank nodded, looking sheepish. "Yup. She told me I'd know it was time to kiss you when it was finally here, and that I'd take you up in the helicopter after the babies were born." I thought she meant Kelsey and Belinda's babies, because I didn't know Kelsey was carrying twins, of course. I'm still surprised that girl was able to keep such a big secret for so long. She doesn't seem like a blabbermouth to me. Just a bit flighty. And she has no ability at all to pick a good baby name. Willow is definitely the best we heard from her, so I'm glad she didn't go with something worse. She wasn't certain she could have ever called a child Widget without laughing. "You and me and the sheriff, heck, the whole ranch is ecstatic. There's not a little Widget lying in that hospital." He drove out onto the main highway, so he could access the road that led to the cabins on the main part of the ranch. "Have you heard about middle names yet?" "Victoria Francine and Willow Amelia is what I heard. They both sound a little too normal for Kelsey, though, don't they?" Debbie couldn't help but grin, wondering why neither baby had Bigfoot or Sasquatch in her name. "A little, but we're not going to act like we even noticed. The names are normal. Now that Mr. and Mrs. Weston are back, I'm sure they're already causing a ruckus. They know a couple of their children's life-mate choices, but not all. It's going to be a hectic few weeks while they're here getting to know everyone." Debbie frowned. "I'm kind of nervous about meeting them. I mean, I've heard only good things, except when someone mentions how much they've tried to control lives from afar. That doesn't sound pleasant at all." Frank frowned. "Well, they do and they don't. I don't think they ever really intended Bob to marry Kelsey. I think they were just trying to light a fire under her. They have a spy somewhere on the ranch, and no one has been able to figure out who it is. As soon as one of their kids starts seeing someone, they know. So when Kelsey started seeing the sheriff, they knew. I think they knew she needed to marry Shane. Those two do seem good together. I mean, who else would put up with Kelsey's wackiness? The sheriff seems so down to earth and serious." Debbie unlocked her front door, happy for her habitual neatness. As a child, she'd thrown things everywhere, but now that she'd been showing houses for almost half of her life, it was easier for her to keep everything spotless all the time. She immediately went to the kitchen to pull some meat from the freezer for supper. She dug through until she found chicken, thinking she'd make a chicken pot pie. She knew he liked home cooking, because of how much he loved Bob's food. It was odd to feel as if she was in competition with her son-in-law for who was the better cook. She stuck the chicken into her Instant Pot, knowing she'd be better able to cut it after it was cooked, before walking into the living room where Frank was waiting patiently. The man seemed to have the patience of a saint. "What do you want to watch?" Frank shrugged. "I have no idea. What do you like to watch?" "I usually stick with 3 shows. I watch Lazy Love, Gilmore Girls, and When Calls the Heart. I have them all memorized, but I love them so I keep watching them over and over." He frowned. "So describe each show in 1 sentence for me, so I can decide which one then." Debbie's eyes gleamed with a challenge. For Lazy Love, spoiled debutantes get dirty on the ranch. For Gilmore Girls, difficult family relations make for great sarcasm. For When Calls the Heart, schoolteacher goes west and falls for Mountie. From those descriptions, I say Gilmore Girls. Gotta love sarcasm." Debbie settled on the couch, close to him, and grabbed the remote, flipping through the smart TV until she found her Netflix and, more importantly, Gilmore Girls. "Give it a chance, but I think you'll like it." She settled close enough to him that her left side was pressed against his right. "I think I could stare at a blank TV and be happy as long as you were sitting this close." She shook her head, laughing. "You sure do know how to turn a girl's head, don't you? You're still looking forward, so I'm really not sure." "Frank?" "Yes?" "Leave the humor for the professionals, please. I don't want to have to hurt your feelings by groaning at your jokes." He settled his arm around her shoulders, pulling her even closer. "I'll do my best. I'm starting with episode 1, which begins with Lorelai begging Luke to give her more coffee. Lorelai and her daughter Rory live to eat at Luke's diner and drink all the coffee in the entire world." Good to know. He wasn't watching the show though. Why would he bother? She was right there, and to him, she was more beautiful than any actress, and more entertaining than any show. She was his dream woman, and soon he'd be able to tell her. He just had to figure out how. Asterisk. After work on Monday, Debbie decided to wander over to Jacqueline's house. She liked Frank a lot, already picturing a future for them together, but she worried that she was betraying Dale by even contemplating another relationship. She knew it was silly, but she couldn't seem to shake the feelings. She stopped at the little house with the snow-covered gnomes in the yard. "Hi, Jacqueline?" She'd met the other woman while she was there for Christmas, and she'd liked her, but now, well, she felt like she was seeing her in a professional capacity. "I was expecting you." Debbie knew better than to ask. The woman knew so many things she shouldn't, and she always blamed it on the gnomes and fairies. She stepped closer, eyeing the front door. She knew Miranda had gone in to speak to her, so she was perfectly safe. It just felt weird. I was hoping you had some time to talk. Jacqueline hooked her arm through Debbie's. Not only time, but I've made snickerdoodles and tea. Sounds delicious, Debbie said, quickly checking the time on her phone. She was meeting Frank at the restaurant on the ranch for dinner and some dancing. She hadn't danced since she taught Scott how, so he wouldn't embarrass himself at prom. Before she knew it, Debbie was settled on a couch with a bunny on each side of her and one perched on her shoulder. She could see several others hopping happily through the house, but there was one sitting on the television that she found disturbing. It was a small gray bunny, must be a baby, and it was staring at her as if it could see right into her soul. Jacqueline poured them both tea and gave her some, offering her a plate filled with snickerdoodles. Oh, don't mind Pepper. I think she's got some fairy in her, and she's making sure I get their point across correctly. So how do you like working at the ranch? I'd be happy to bring one of my bunnies over if you wanted to let the children play with it. Debbie hadn't thought about that. She'd have to research the laws on bringing an animal into the facility. I'll think on it. And the ranch? I hear you were there when Kelsey had those beautiful little girls. I remember being with Kelsey's grandmother in the waiting room when Kelsey was born. Twins are a blessing, aren't they? Aren't all babies? Debbie asked, smiling. Well, of course, they are, but there's something special about twins. I don't think Kelsey's are identical, which should make her and Danny very happy. Those girls never did take to being twins until just recently. Jacqueline studied Debbie over her teacup. But enough talk about babies. Let's get down to why you're really here. Frank. Am I so transparent? Debbie felt the heat rising to her face. It was odd having a relationship with the entire ranch watching. Well, Frank already came to talk to me, and the fairies told me when you were here at Christmas that you'd be in a relationship with Frank someday. Debbie leaned forward, causing the bunny perched on her shoulder to scramble onto her back and then to the arm of the couch, looking at her reproachfully. Then why do I feel so much guilt for my feelings for Frank? I feel like I'm doing something wrong by dating someone other than my kid's father. What would Dale have wanted? Jacqueline took a bite of a cookie as she asked. Dale? How'd you know his name? Jacqueline shrugged. The fairies, or your daughter. Or one of the gnomes. Gorgeous George has a great deal more insight into love and romance than most of the gnomes. Especially now that he's hooking up with beautiful Bella. I think the fairies have given him some extra insight to make up for what happened to his predecessor. Debbie bit her lip to keep from asking. Questioning what happened to a gnome's predecessor didn't seem like something she should do. Well, I'm glad the fairies are granting extra insight. You wouldn't want a war between the fairies and the gnomes simply because the fairies are so much more gifted in love. You're very insightful. Jacqueline shook her head. But I think if your Dale would have disliked the idea of you falling in love with another man 20 years after his death, then he wasn't worthy of you. And let's face it, you're a bright woman. If Dale hadn't been worthy of you, you'd have forgotten him long ago. No, your Dale was a good man. Have you ever been in love, Jacqueline? Debbie wasn't sure where the question came from, but she felt compelled to ask it. Well, of course I have. He died before we could marry. He was a police officer, much like your Dale. Jacqueline raised her hand to stop Debbie from responding. I know your man was in the Air Force, just like your Frank was. Sounds like Scott is heading in that direction as well. You and your Flyboys. Debbie shrugged. I guess that's what I'm drawn to. How did you enjoy your helicopter ride yesterday? Debbie didn't want to know how Jacqueline came by her plethora of information. It was wonderful. I loved seeing the area from the sky that way. Frank is a wonderful guide and a fabulous cook. Jacqueline grinned. His team didn't hold a candle to yours in the snow sculpting contest, though. I just wish I'd known I had a woman in labor helping build that silly Bigfoot. You can't blame yourself for that. Kelsey, well, sometimes I think twins only get half a brain. She certainly acted as if she was mentally deficient for participating while laboring with twins, don't you think? You might have a point. Debbie couldn't outright agree with Jacqueline. It was one thing for a woman who had known Kelsey all her life to speak that way about her. It was another thing for a new employee of the ranch. Oh, you know I do. You're just too diplomatic to admit it. Jacqueline sighed. As for you and Frank, you need to follow your heart. That man has a whole lot of feelings all bottled up inside. You need to let him express them, or he might just explode. Debbie frowned. I do? Yes, and you're going to be late. Go to the restaurant, eat, dance, and be merry. Have a wonderful time, because you deserve happiness in your life, Debbie. You raised a wonderful girl whose snickerdoodles don't hold a candle to mine. You're right about that. I want the recipe. Jacqueline shook her head. All right. Off with you. Give me my bunnies back. Debbie set down her teacup and plate, heading for the door. Jacqueline certainly made it clear when she was done talking to someone. Thank you for your time, Jacqueline. And thank the fairies for me, would you? Jacqueline seemed to find something hilarious about her words as she shut the door in Debbie's face. Debbie shook her head, not knowing what to think. She wasn't sure if she knew anything more after their discussion than she had before it. Chapter 9. After she got back from lunch on Wednesday, Debbie had a meeting for her newly hired teachers. As she was talking about what she expected of each of them, the door to the school age room, where the meeting was held, opened and she glanced to see who was there. There stood a couple who looked to be in their mid-50s. Debbie stood up. May I help you? The woman shook her head. No, thank you. We'll just sit here quietly and listen. I'm afraid this is a meeting for staff only. Would you welcome Wade Weston to this meeting? The man asked, looking amused. Debbie frowned. Of course I would. But you're not Wade Weston. He stepped forward and offered his hand to shake. I'm Wilbur Weston, Wade's father. He nodded at the woman beside him. This is Bobby Weston. Debbie shook his hand, feeling like an idiot. Now that he'd said it, she could see the resemblance. It's nice to meet you. Go ahead and have a seat. She sat back down and glanced at her notes, thinking about everything she'd thought was imperative to share in this meeting. The Westons would be bored to tears listening. For a moment, she considered skipping several points, but then she took a deep breath and continued on as planned. She wasn't there to entertain the owners of the ranch. Her job was to make sure the children were safe when they opened in a week and a half. As she went through the details, she felt the Westons' eyes on her, but she never flinched. She made sure each of her teachers knew to be there on Friday for their CPR and first aid training. I want everyone to have training for every age. I don't care if you'll only be working with school-aged children. There will be babies in the building. You will know how to stop them from choking, as well as the correct way to administer CPR. Any questions? When Mrs. Weston raised her hand, Debbie nodded to her. Yes, Mrs. Weston? I would like to attend the class. I have 3 grandchildren, soon to be 4. I feel like it would be best if I knew CPR as well. Debbie nodded. I can add you in. The ranch is footing the bill anyway, she said with a grin. Mrs. Weston nodded. I wouldn't have it any other way. After the meeting was over, the teachers went to their individual rooms to start personalizing them. It was the first day they'd all met. Debbie was cautiously optimistic that there would be no backbiting among the teachers, though she'd never worked in a child care facility where everyone had gotten along well. She was gathering up her notes, planning to go and speak with Belle, her assistant manager, for a bit when she realized that the Westons were still watching her. "Is there something else I can help you with?" Mrs. Weston walked around the table to where Debbie was seated. "First, I want to thank you for being there for my girls when I couldn't be. I know Kelsey and Danny would have been fine, but Kelsey really wanted me to be there. I still can't believe we didn't make it. That freak snowstorm that blew in still has me angry." "Oh, you're very welcome. I guess it was good practice for when my daughter has her first. Second, we'd like a tour of the center. Especially of the baby room and the school-aged room. We'll have 3 granddaughters spending time here soon." "3? Has Belinda said she's having a girl?" "I hadn't heard yet. Belinda doesn't know yet, or at least that's what she's saying. No, I'm talking about Maddie's daughter Vivian. She's going to be in the school-aged room when she's here." Debbie smiled. "I'm thrilled you already think of her as a granddaughter. She's a sweetheart." "She is. We're both excited to have grandchildren coming out of the woodwork all of a sudden. I think us going away for a while helped our children to realize it was time for them to finally settle down. I know I've thought so for years." Mr. Weston stepped close to his wife and put his arm around her. "Now for the tour, if you don't mind." "Of course not." As Debbie spread her arms out, showing them the school-aged room, she efficiently explained why she'd ordered each of the things there. "There are going to be children of the ranch employees bussed in after school, but then they'll come and join the school-aged children of the guests. Our center will be open from 5 in the morning until midnight, which are long hours. During the week, we'll have 3 shifts. The weekends will only be open from 10 until midnight, so there'll be 2 shifts on the weekends. There are 3 managers. I'll be here from 5 until 3, and then my assistant manager will be here from 3 to midnight. On the weekends, there will be a resident college student for the morning and another for the evening shift, and Belle and I will each be on call every other weekend. We want to make sure one of us with more experience is always available." She led them through the school-aged area, with one section for students wanting to do homework, a video game area, a library area, and a game area. There'll be organized activities and even some field trips that involved sleigh rides or hay rides, depending on the time of year. The 2 teachers for the school-aged children have been elementary teachers, but have chosen to stop teaching full-time. Both of them have preschool-aged children and want to be with them. We allow them to do that." Mrs. Weston smiled. "It seems like you've thought of everything." "Actually, most of it was already in place before I arrived. I added a few things here and there, but your children did a fabulous job thinking of just about everything that would be needed for the type of facility we'll run." She closed the door to the school-aged area and led them to the baby room. "This is the room for the infants. We'll have a 4-baby capacity, but we may want to expand that immediately. I'm trying to decide. The problem with 4 babies is that 3 of the spots will be taken up by your grandchildren almost immediately. But 4 is the maximum allowed to be taught by one person at a time. If we go to an 8-baby capacity, then we'll need 2 teachers at all times, but we'll also need twice the space. But most parents aren't bringing babies that age to a ranch like this, so we're still trying to decide. I may wait and see how many infants we get in the first month or so and decide from there." "I hadn't thought of that," Mr. Weston said with a frown. "And if we hire 2 teachers per shift and only need 1, we have people out of work. That's not fair to them." "Yes, I see how it happens. Maybe you could have a couple of people who could be on call?" "Maybe. I can look into that, but I do worry that they would find something else if they weren't called in often. We'll of course have 2 people per shift during the summer and the Christmas seasons, but I'm not sure about the rest of the year." Debbie walked over and showed them the lesson plans that would be implemented based on the babies' ages. Mrs. Weston picked up one of the pillows that was on the floor in a little circle. "These are so sweet. Where did you get these? Debbie smiled. I spent my first weekend here at the ranch sewing them. I love the idea of the room having my own personal touches, just like my children's nurseries did back when they were small. Mr. Weston frowned. Are you salaried or hourly? I'm salaried. Well, you need to let Wade know you put in extra hours that way. You deserve a comp day off. I couldn't do that. I made the pillows because I wanted to. Debbie didn't add that she made one to match the quilt her daughter made for Kelsey's babies as well. Now she and Miranda were pushing to get the second quilt done. They didn't want to slight one of the babies. It would have been nice if Kelsey had told everyone about the twins. You'll find that we're very fair employers, Mrs. Weston said. If you spent a weekend making pillows, then you deserve to have that time off. Maybe during the summer when you'll have your college students who can take over easier. Debbie nodded. Maybe. Mr. Weston smiled at Debbie and nodded. I like what you've done here. I think Wade made a good choice on a director for the Kids Korral. You obviously know what you're doing. I'm very happy to be working here at the ranch. My daughter Miranda is the baker here, and I'm really thrilled to be able to live so close to her. And you're dating our pilot, Mrs. Weston added, a grin on her face. I heard you two had spies everywhere. Debbie wasn't sure how she felt about her name being on people's lips, but she couldn't stop it in such a small community. Mrs. Weston laughed. Not spies. We just have people who have been loyal to us for so long, they don't know any other way to be. I think you and Frank would make a good couple. The fairies think so too, Debbie blurted out. The Westons merely laughed. Jacqueline is a character, isn't she? Where are you two staying while you're back at the ranch? We didn't want to put anyone out, so we're in the RV park. We like living in our simple little vehicle. Mrs. Weston reached out and hugged Debbie. Thanks for taking care of our girl. I'm sure we'll see you around. After the two of them left, Debbie stood staring at the door for a moment, trying to remember what she'd been planning to do before they'd changed the course of her day. Oh, yeah. She and Belle needed to have a meeting to make sure they were both on the same page. She gathered up her notes and went to Belle's office, a bit confused about the people she'd just met. Asterisk. When Frank arrived for supper a few hours later, Debbie greeted him with a quick kiss. You will never believe who came to visit the Kids Korral today. The Westons? He asked. How'd you know? Do you have spies too? They're just showing up everywhere. They were at the cafe for breakfast and visited the blacksmith shop. Kelsey got home from the hospital today, and they saw that she was settled at home and headed out to check out the ranch. It's almost like they're evaluating all the work their kids did while they were gone. I sure hope they're not stressing everyone out. Wade doesn't need any more stress in his life. None of them do. It's been a rough time since they left. They call every so often and demand that the kids do something else. The event barn and the Kids Korral and the spa and the kitchen upgrade are all examples of that. The ranch is on a totally different level than it was even 18 months ago. Debbie nodded, stirring the stew she'd made for supper. I've heard all that, but I didn't see it in the sweet couple I met. They were so nice. They wanted a tour of the rooms they'd have grandkids in, and they counted Maddie's little girl as one of their grandkids, and Wade and Maddie aren't even married yet. I was expecting ogres, but that's not what we got. Frank shrugged. I've always gotten along well with them. They're a nice couple. I love that I'm not just flying a small plane anymore, and I get to spend time in a helicopter. I have no complaints about any of the changes they've made, unless maybe it's that they've put undue stress on the kids. Debbie started at a knock on the door. She glanced over her shoulder at Frank. Would you get that? I need to get the biscuits out of the oven. Oh, sure. Frank opened the door and saw someone who was vaguely familiar to him. I'm Frank. Why are you at my mom's house? Debbie turned at her son's voice. Scott. What are you doing here? Both of my Thursday professors are out tomorrow, and I don't have any classes on Fridays, so I thought I'd come and see my mom. Scott walked to her and leaned down to hug her tightly, before pointing over his shoulder with his thumb. Who is this joker? That's Frank. He's my friend. She wasn't sure what to call him, and she thought friend would be easier for Scott at first. She'd explain it all later, but there was no need to get into that discussion in front of Frank. He's the pilot here at the ranch. You may have met him in December when we were here. I don't think so. Why is he here? Frank frowned. Maybe I should go. I'll see you at lunch tomorrow, Debbie. Without another word, Frank opened the door and left. He'd get dinner at the restaurant. He kept hearing her say friend. Why hadn't she introduced him as more than that? Debbie frowned at Scott as soon as Frank had left. Why were you so rude? I raised you to act better than that. The man's a veteran, and he deserves your respect. Scott frowned. Veteran or not, I don't like strangers sniffing around my mom. She blinked a couple of times. Sniffing around your mom? She took a step toward him, ignoring the fact that he was almost a foot taller than her. Do you realize that I've spent the last 20 years totally alone? I didn't so much as have a lunch date with a man, for fear that it would divide my focus between my children and a relationship? Well, guess what? You and Miranda are adults on your own now, and where does that leave me? Totally alone in this world. Well, you didn't want to date anyone. You still love Dad. She closed her eyes and counted to 10. I will always love your father. Your first love is a love you never forget. Especially when he's also your husband and the father of your children. But I've been seeing Frank since I came to the ranch. We started out as just friends, but we've become more than that. Scott stared at her for a minute, looking shocked. You're dating that guy? Yes, I'm dating that guy. She sighed. Sit down and we'll talk over supper. I made enough for two, but I didn't think I'd be sharing with my son. He frowned as he walked to the sink and washed his hands. Debbie couldn't help but wonder if he was washing his hands for her sake or if he did that when she wasn't around. I'll listen, but I'm not going to promise to like him. You know what, Scott? I don't care if you like him or not. You're a grown man who is about to go into the military. Your sister is grown and married. Who I see is my business, and no one else's. You can hate him with everything inside you, and it won't matter to me, because I think he's wonderful. She filled his bowl with stew and set it on the table in front of him. What do you think of that? Scott frowned. I don't like it. First Miranda marries Bob. Now you're dating Frank. What is up with that? You don't think your sister and I should marry? What's wrong with you? He sighed. I feel like it's my job to check these guys out first, but I didn't get that chance with you or with Miranda. He ate a bite of his stew, looking his mother in the eye for the first time since his arrival. I'm sorry. I'm being a jerk. Tell me about Frank. You are being a jerk, but I'll tell you about him anyway. You know why? Because I like him a lot. And if he wants to take on a 40-something woman with 2 grown kids, I'm more than willing to marry the man. He's wonderful. She went on to talk about Frank, telling her son all the things he didn't need to know about the man she'd just realized she was in love with. Chapter 10. Scott slept on Debbie's couch that night, and Debbie tiptoed out early in the morning so as not to wake him. She'd not eaten breakfast at the cafe since she'd gotten to the ranch, but she really wanted to talk to Frank. Scott had agreed he'd apologize to him because he knew he'd been a jerk, but she felt that it was partly her fault for not telling Scott she was in a relationship. She knew the whole idea of his mother dating was foreign to him. It wasn't something she'd done. She drove over to the cafe instead of walking, the chill in the air too much for her. Usually she loved early morning walks in the cold, but for some reason the very idea offended her today. When she stepped into the warmth of the cafe, she immediately looked around. She was still having trouble adjusting to not seeing Kelsey as soon as she walked in. After a minute, she spotted Frank, sitting in a booth, by himself, a glass of orange juice in his hand. She walked over and tapped him on the shoulder, putting on her sexiest voice. "Got any room for me, Flyboy?" Frank looked at her, his eyes as cold as the frigid morning air. "It's a free country." Debbie frowned, slipping into the booth across from him. "Are you upset with me?" "I don't know. Should I be? I'm sorry about the way Scott talked to you last night. He'll be talking to you himself today. It won't happen again." Joni came to the table. She was in charge during Kelsey's maternity leave. "What do you want to drink?" Debbie shrugged. "Hot chocolate and water would be great." "Do you know what you want to eat yet?" Frank's already ordered. Debbie's eyes met his. "What do I want to eat?" She'd never seen the cafe's breakfast menu. "Give her what I'm having." Frank knew her tastes well enough by now that he had no qualms about ordering for her. After Joni walked off, Debbie reached out for Frank's hand, winding her fingers through his. He didn't pull away from her, but he didn't exactly squeeze her hand back. "Are you upset about how Scott acted?" "Not really. If he didn't know we were dating, then he had no reason to respect me." "He had every reason. He's been raised to show respect to everyone, not just when he feels like it." Frank shook his head and pulled his hand away from her grip. "Maybe if you'd introduced me as something more than a friend." Debbie sighed. "I'm in my mid-40s. You're older than me. What the heck am I supposed to call you? My boyfriend? That doesn't sound right. My beau? I'd feel like something from a bad romance novel. My suitor? Well, that makes me feel like I live in 1894. There's no real word. You're not my lover, because we haven't, you know." So I went with friend, expecting that I'd expound on it quickly, which I did, but you were already gone. Frank wanted to argue with her, but he saw her point. There were no good words for their relationship in the English language. "So what did you end up telling him?" "I told him we were in a relationship, but that feels weird too. We're dating, which works, but I don't know how to use one word to sum up the only man I've wanted to date in 20 years, the man who makes me feel alive again, the man I love, the only man I'd consider a serious relationship with. There's no way to put all that into one word. How about calling me your marshmallow head?" That phrase never even occurred to me." "Well, I've decided that I must be soft in the head. I've spent the last 12 hours furious with you for not introducing me as more than a friend to your son. And now you're telling me it was only because you didn't have the right word, which means that I was an absolute idiot." He shook his head. "I love you too, you know." "I didn't know, but I sure hoped." She put her hand next to his, not feeling like she could be as bold as she'd been a minute ago. He took her hand in his. "Can you forgive me?" "Sure thing, marshmallow head." Joni stopped beside the table, looking back and forth between the two of them. "I'm not sure I was supposed to hear that. Or anyone was." The confused look on her face had Frank laughing. Inside joke. "Let's keep it that way, shall we?" Joni set hot chocolate and a big glass of water onto the table. "I'll be back with your breakfast in just a minute." Debbie grinned at Frank. "I'm not sure that name is going to work. How about Snarltooth?" She laughed. "Sounds like something Kelsey would call one of her babies." "I does, doesn't it?" "How about Love Machine?" Her eyes grew wide and she dissolved into a fit of giggles. Bob came out of the kitchen to see who was making so much noise, and shook his head at her. You need to learn to behave. Frank's the one making me laugh. She shook her head. I'm not calling you love machine. That's absolutely ridiculous. He frowned. Well, then why don't you call me fiancé? So much better than any of those other names anyway. That would be a lie. She shook her head. I can't lie to people. Her heart sped up at the mere idea, though. She loved the idea of being engaged to him, almost as much as she loved the idea of being married to him. He leaned to one side, sticking his hand deep into his front pocket. It doesn't have to be a lie. I got you this. I've been carrying it around for a couple of weeks now. He flipped open the small box in his hand, showing her a diamond ring. If you don't like it, I'll find another. She blinked at it, then up at him again. Frank? Are you asking me to marry you? I'm obviously doing an awful job of it if you have to ask me that. Yes, I'm asking you to marry me. This is my first marriage proposal, and I'm obviously messing it up, but please? She took a deep breath. I'd love to marry you. She held her hand up. But I want you to wait to give me the ring. Tomorrow night, I'll fix dinner for Scott, Miranda, Bob, and you. We'll eat at my place, and you can give me the ring in front of my kids. Frank frowned. Scott doesn't like me. Scott doesn't know you. She shook her head. I booked a helicopter tour for him this afternoon. You two can talk and get to know each other. He groaned. I don't want to. He felt like a petulant child, but after the way the previous evening had ended, he had no desire to spend time with her son. Please? For me? He groaned. How can I turn you down when you look at me with those beautiful green eyes? Joni plopped food down between them. Enjoy. Debbie stared down at her plate, poking at her French toast with her fork. Does Bob always make French toast shaped like hearts? Frank stared down at his plate. He never has before. I guess he knew something was up. How could he not have? She grinned at him. So you and Scott will spend the afternoon together, and I'll invite everyone over to my house tomorrow night. The kids need to share our joy. It's a good thing I like Miranda, he muttered, stabbing his food with unnecessary intensity. Asterisk. Frank didn't know what to expect as he waited at the helipad for Scott. He didn't really want to spend any time alone with the kid, but he didn't want to upset Debbie either. Truly, Scott had made his opinions clear the previous evening, and he didn't think anything was going to change his mind. Scott walked over to the helicopter, and straight to Frank, offering his hand. I'm very sorry for the way I treated you last night. My mom's never dated before, not in my lifetime anyway. I didn't know how to react. I should have known better. Frank was floored by the apology. Debbie had said he'd be getting one, but he hadn't believed her. I guess I can understand that. Will you forgive me? Frank was surprised by how serious the boy looked. He seemed to really care if he was forgiven. Yeah. I guess I'd have reacted the same way if I'd had someone as special as your mom in my life and I was worried someone wasn't treating her right. Scott smiled, nodding. Thank you, sir. Maybe we can start over today. I'd like that. Asterisk. At lunch the next day, Frank told Debbie how much he'd enjoyed the time with Scott. He was very respectful and full of questions about the Air Force. I couldn't help but like him. I'm so glad. Thank you for giving him a second chance. He really didn't deserve it. She was still a bit frustrated with how Scott had treated Frank, but she thought she understood where he was coming from. I want to get along well with him. He's your son. He brought her fingers to his lips and kissed them. When do you want to get married? She shrugged. I did the big wedding thing with Dale, and all it did was stress me out. I don't feel the need to go through all that again. I was hoping you'd say that. We could do a little wedding in the chapel in the old West town. Say a month from now? Frank hoped she wouldn't insist on a long engagement. He didn't want to wait to have her be his wife. She shrugged. I'm all for the chapel. We could marry this weekend or next month. He swallowed hard. She'd given him the answer he really wanted. You wouldn't feel like you were rushing into it if we got married this weekend? I feel like my kids are already here, so we should just get to it. Her hands joined with his in the middle of the table. I'm well aware that life can be short. I'll never again wait for a year or two to do something, knowing that things can change in the blink of an eye. I believe in grabbing the brass ring. Now that I know I'm in love with you, let's just do it. He grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. I was afraid to suggest it, because it didn't seem like the kind of thing you'd go for, but I'm so happy you think that too. Talk to Pastor Kevin, would you? I think a Sunday afternoon wedding would be perfect. You are definitely the woman of my dreams. We think the same way. She laughed. We'll have time to explore all that. Very soon. Asterisk. Debbie fixed her kid's favorite meal, enchilada casserole, and she and Frank were putting supper on the table when Miranda and Bob arrived with Scott in tow. He'd spent the afternoon with them, wanting to get to know Bob a little bit better. When the five of them were sitting down to eat, Debbie nodded at Frank, letting him know it was time. So, I asked your mom a question yesterday. Miranda put her hand over her mouth. Really? Debbie grinned. She knew that Miranda would understand. She nodded at her daughter. Frank pulled the ring from his pocket. She wanted to wait to wear the ring until we'd talked to both of you about it. Scott frowned. This is happening really fast. Faster than you think, Debbie replied as Frank slipped the ring on her finger. We're getting married this Sunday. I thought you'd want to be here for it. Are you sure? Scott seemed to really have a hard time dealing with the change. He'd taken Miranda's wedding a lot easier than he was Debbie's. I'm positive. I've never known a man who could make me feel loved like Frank can. Trust me, Scott. This is a good move for all of us. Scott nodded and swallowed hard. Congratulations. He shook Frank's hand. Welcome to the family. Don't worry, I won't ask you to call me Dad. Frank said with a grin. I'm not sure I could yet. I've honestly never called anyone that. Frank frowned. He'd forgotten that Scott had never known a father. Let me amend that. I won't ask you to call me Dad, but you're welcome to if you feel the desire. Scott nodded. Thanks. Debbie watched her son for a moment, making sure he was all right with the news, but he seemed fine. So, Miranda, I think I need a matron of honor. That would be me. Miranda laughed. Too bad Kelsey's twins aren't a little older. They'd have made great flower girls. Yes, they would have. The two women spoke about what they were going to do to the church for the wedding, while Scott and Frank talked about the Air Force again. At the end of the night, Frank kissed Debbie. That went well. Debbie nodded. Better than I'd hoped. Now do we get to live happily ever after? She sighed. If only this were a romance novel, we would. Hopefully God is smiling on this marriage. I know he is. As Debbie watched Frank leave, she couldn't help but smile. In just 2 days, they wouldn't be going home to their separate places. She was ready to be in a marriage again. Ready for love again. Thank God for second chances.